And this week, we have a big guest for you. He is the host of Shut Up and Wrestle on the Arcadian Vanguard Network. He is a contributor to Pro Wrestling Illustrated and Inside the Ropes magazines. He has written the books WWE Legends, Pro Wrestling FAQ, and his newest book, Blood and Fire, the unbelievable real-life story of wrestling's original Sheik. He is an author, pop culture critic, wrestling historian, the great Brian R. Solomon. Brian, how are you doing today?
Wow, thanks, Joe. I'm doing really well. I'm the great Brian R. Solomon. The great Brian Last might have something to say about that, but I'm glad to be here and I'm glad to be considered great. So thank you.
Hey, we are happy to have you here because you just wrote the book about the original Sheik, and that led us to wondering, when did your pro wrestling fandom start, and who were some of your early favorites?
Well, my answer to that is always kind of dull because I wish I had a different kind of response. But I came in when so many people my age came in. I'm 47 years old. I started really getting into wrestling in 1987 in the build up to WrestleMania 3. So I'd known about it and I knew kids that liked it before that. You'd hear people talking about it at school, Hulk Hogan, WrestleMania, and all that stuff, the first WrestleMania. But I got into it myself in that whole Andre the Giant turning on Hulk Hogan, watching Piper's Pit. In fact, one of my earliest memories of just turning it on, you want to talk about conversion moment, watching the Piper's Pit when Andre the Giant turned on Hulk Hogan and ripped the crucifix off his chest with Bobby the Brain Heenan there and it gloating and everything. That was just like, okay, I'm in. I don't know what this is, but I'm in, and I'm going to watch it again next week and the week after that. So that was it. My early favorites, I mean, I know this sounds weird, but probably my first favorite wrestler was Ken Patera. And it wasn't even the great heel Ken Patera when he was actually really good. It was when they brought him back when he got out of jail. Because, again, I'm 12. I'm just starting to watch this. I don't even know who he is or what he did to go to jail. I just thought it was fascinating. This guy who came out of jail, he wasn't a good guy. He had he'd done some bad things. And now, as Vince McMahon would say every 5 seconds, he has paid his debt to society. That got me. Like, I know that's considered, it's not really one of the great characters in wrestling, but I liked him. Also, when Bam Bam Bigelow came in as a baby face with Oliver Humperdinck as his manager, and he's doing cartwheels in the ring. The guy's like 350 pounds. He was a favorite. Very quickly later in that year when they turned Randy Savage face, he became a favorite. I hate to say it now, but Ultimate Warrior at the time, because again, I was a child. That would be in my own opinion, the only excuse for being a fan of the Ultimate Warrior. I never was a huge Hulk Hogan fan. I always wanted him to lose in those days. I couldn't wait to see who the next champion was going to be, But those were my early favorites.
I just real quick, Brian, I was gonna say I love everything you're saying. Come on, that I identify with their fandom so much. I don't usually do, but just to you'll know what I'm talking about. Anyone wants to look it up. The Bobby Heenan Ken Patera debate where Patera whips him with the belt, and it's unbelievable the bump Bobby takes in that. It's amazing.
Yeah. But that's another thing that, from the point of view of a child, right? I know exactly what you're talking about. The Bobby Heenan Ken Patera debate in the ring with the podiums and everything, where they were the things that Bobby Heenan was saying, they were bleeping out.
Yes.
And on the bottom of the screen, it said something like, due to the heinous nature. I remember the word heinous. Due to the heinous nature of Bobby Heenan's comments, they're not fit for television or something like that. Now, I'm sure that wasn't actually the case. However, as a kid, again, I'm just like, what is he saying? Oh my God, what could be that bad that they won't allow it on television? Oh my God, what could he be saying? This is how you make a lifelong fan with things like that. It's so simple.
And it's funny, it sounds like we all got hooked around that same time, because my earliest memories of wrestling are Hulk Hogan. And now that I've gone back and watched old superstars of wrestling, I remember the intro with Hogan in the tunnel at MSG waiting to come out. And just that early, you got the Rock and Wrestling cartoons, that all just brought me in. And Hogan was an early favorite. And I talked with somebody last night at work how, Hogan and Warrior were early favorites of a lot of people. And as you get older, you almost don't want to say it, because if you're a fan of wrestling, their styles were very limited. They could do what they could do, but you wouldn't necessarily call them an in-ring great.
Well, here's the thing with those two guys. And over the years, it's weird what's happened with my opinions of things. So as I became an adult and learned more about wrestling, I actually grew to like and respect the Ultimate Warrior as a worker less. However, I grew to like and respect Hulk Hogan as a worker, maybe not as a person always, but I want to point that out. But as a worker, more than I did back then.
Mhm.
And I really feel like those two guys are very different in the sense that, I mean, neither one of them is going to do any kind of chain wrestling or put on some kind of like mat wrestling clinic. They don't need to. The difference is Hogan had a power over fans that stood the test of time, and it lasted years and years, where he could hold them in the palm of his hand. And there is something to be said for that. Whatever he was doing, it was working, and he knew how to do it. He was also very underrated as a promo. A great promo. Ultimate Warrior, not. And I know there's people who love Warrior promos, and I guess maybe if you first saw something when you were 7, you're never going to let go of how great it was. But like Hogan told me once himself when I was interviewing him, he goes to me, I've told this story before, but he's like, I always get criticized for my working style, and it's limited, and I don't do a lot of technical stuff. And he goes, guys like Guerrero, Benoit, this was 20 years ago, Malenko and Mysterio, those guys, they move around the ring like lightning. They're flying everywhere. They're doing a million moves a second. The audience goes insane, loses their mind. And then he goes, you know what? I do this. And the response is identical, if not more, from the audience. So he goes, why should I do what they do? They do what they do. I do what I do. They couldn't do what I do. And I could not argue with that. He had a point. He knew what he was doing. The Warrior was much more limited, where that act grew stale very quickly. I mean, he came on the scene at the end of 87. He got super hot, 88, 89. He beats Hogan. And then it kind of just starts to fizzle away, like as soon as he wins the belt. So he really was not the second coming of Hulk Hogan, like a lot of people thought he would be. I mean, they used to joke about how he was already blown up by the time the bell rang, which is very true because of his whole ring entrance. He just was not trained the same way. I mean, Hogan was trained by some really legit people. He just knew what he had to do and what he didn't have to do. He's a lot like the Sheik, the guy I wrote the book about. The Sheik could do it all. He could tie you in knots. He was an amateur wrestling champion in the Army as a young man. He just knew he didn't have to do that. He worked a limited style. It worked. He drew more money than anybody else. That's smart in my estimation.
Absolutely.
It's a long answer. I'm sorry. That's a very long.
All right. No, that was great. Yeah. I mean, you do hear about like guys like I think another one, like as a kid, I probably didn't like him because I was a kid, but like Jerry Lawler. But then you see how much Jerry Lawler got out of a crowd with a little. And as an adult, if you really separate from even pro wrestling as a fan, like the idea of getting the most out of anything you do for a little, it's like that's that's a great life thing right there.
Jerry Lawler was very believable. He threw probably some of the best punches that there ever were. He was a fantastic brawler. He didn't look like you would look at him and go, well, he just, he's from that era. But I think he also benefited from being where he was. The skinny on Lawler even back then was he's happy to be a big fish in a small pond. And I sometimes wonder what would have happened if he did more touring, if he went to more territories and things. He might have got lost in the shuffle, because whenever he goes somewhere else, he's kind of a few notches down. He's not like somebody like a Dusty Rhodes or Ric Flair or Andre the Giant, or, when they go places, they're still massive wherever they go. Not really the case with Jerry Lawler. I mean, there was the AWA because they had the working arrangement with Memphis. But for the most part, like, he stayed in his area. He was a huge deal there, a legend to this day. And that was smart in and of itself. And that helped to get himself over.
1,000%.
Yeah. Now, how do you go from being such a big fan of wrestling to working for the WWE? Because that has got to be almost like a mind-blowing experience in itself.
Yeah, it was mind-blowing because it was almost like you couldn't have scripted it more. It was almost like a screenplay of a movie or something because of all the people. Like, I was that one person that everybody knows that's like, "Oh my god, that guy is just nuts about pro wrestling. He never shuts up about it. He just thinks about it constantly." I'm writing about it in college and things. So I was like the ideal person that could ever happen to. Like I said, it was almost like a movie. But it was a very mundane way that it happened. I took a job out of college. I wanted to be a writer and editor when there was much more of a future in magazines and book publishing and this is the late 90s. And I was doing, just non-wrestling stuff. It was reference books and very like nonfiction kind of academic almost stuff. And my heart was in wrestling. I had done some of that in as a kid, like on neighborhood papers and college newspaper and things like that. And I was looking for a better job. I had just gotten married and I found it in the classified section of the New York Times. Just the most simple thing. There was a WWF scratch logo in the classified section of the New York Times, drew my attention. You do not see that in the New York Times classified section all the time. You don't see the New York Times classified section anymore. But I applied to it. They made me jump through a million hoops. My first interview was October 1999, and I didn't start until Valentine's Day 2000. So it was this whole multiple interviews, multiple trips from Brooklyn to Stamford, Connecticut. At first, I didn't get it. They gave it to somebody else. Then they called me back. They needed another person. It was this whole convoluted thing. But again, it's like I'm going into Titan Tower. I'm being interviewed and I'm just going like, I can't believe this is happening. This doesn't feel real. And I'm like praying. I'm like, I don't know if anyone's listening to this. I don't know if this works or not. I'm going to try it. Just if there is some karma in the universe, maybe could I get this job? Because even while I'm going through it all, I'm thinking like, I'm not getting this. This is not going to happen. But at least I could say I went there, whatever. But it actually happened. It was like so surreal, so surreal.
Now, what was the experience working there? Because I mean, we hear a lot that TV is chaotic. Does the magazine operate in the same way? Or what can you say about your time overall?
So I always have to clarify that because it is two worlds. And there's TV and there's corporate. And we weren't even in the same building, just to be clear. So there's a TV, the Titan Tower that everybody knows, that big building on I-95 in Connecticut with the big flag and everything, the giant glass box,
Yeah.
those are the corporate offices. That is not where TV is produced. That's where all the suits are, So like TV production is down the road. It's about a 10-minute drive into downtown Stamford. Titan Tower is not in downtown. It's kind of outside in a residential area, which is very weird. But it's this little studio, nondescript. You would miss it if you were driving by. And it's a little like, it looks like I don't know.
Almost like a warehouse of sorts.
It does look a little like a warehouse. Yeah. And you go, and that's where the TV was produced. I would go there occasionally for things that I had to do, but that's not where I worked. And, it was a different environment. It was working in Titan Tower. It was weird because there were two sides of it. So it was very corporate. You did feel like you were working for a media corporation. It didn't necessarily have that hectic feel of TV production, but it's also the world of wrestling. So underneath the surface of that corporate, very like kind of, button down thing, there is the kind of how do I put this? the underbelly of the wrestling business, the stuff that makes it into Dark Side of the Ring, that mentality, it crosses over from the road, it crosses over from TV, and it kind of permeates everything. So I don't want to characterize it as being like any other corporate environment. It was not. So it was like a weird blending of those two worlds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, wrestling's always seemed weird. It's almost like the carnival going legit. So it's like you're always going to want to have those people that want to run it like a business, but in the end, it's always the carnival. So you can't get out of that kind of mind state at times. Now, have you always been a writer? Because you said you wrote articles, even for like your childhood neighborhood papers. What was the first article you wrote and what was it about? Do you remember?
Well, I mean, even in my high school paper, I was already writing because I knew I wanted to be a writer. I didn't necessarily know I wanted to do like hard journalism. I was always on the fence about that. But because I don't know if I could be that much of a jerk. Like you kind of have to be a jerk and really like be aggressive and kind of put people's humanity sometimes aside to get your story. And I don't always know if I had that in me, but I like to write and I love to read. So in my high school paper, I would write little things, you know, just I think the first thing I ever saw with my name in print was an article in the high school newspaper, the Severian Clipper newspaper, which was about a blood drive that they had at the high school. I mean, like very exciting. But I also had a cartoon that I would do called The Wisdom of Solomon. And those were like the first times that I officially saw myself in print. And it wasn't just, I mean, as a kid, I was making my own books and things like, you know, on paper. Like I even as a small child, maybe 10, 11, 12, I started trying to do like a neighborhood newspaper. I don't even want to call it that. It was basically a couple of pieces of paper printed out on a Commodore 64 dot matrix printer where I would, you know, the stop sign on the corner of 65th Street got hit by a car and knocked over, and I'll be following up on when it's going to be repaired. Or, you know, my grandfather took a dip in a swimming pool for the first time in 50 years. And here's what he had to say, you know, like that. But I still had the instinct of wanting to do that kind of thing. But really, it really took off when I was in college because I pitched doing a wrestling column for the Brooklyn College Kingsman paper, and it was called Wrestling Lowdown. And this was in the era of kayfabe, really, the internet. I wasn't even on the internet yet. This is 1994. I was getting my information from phone hotlines and early fanzines and things like that. I did that. And I was also we had neighborhood papers, the Home Reporter and the Brooklyn Spectator. And I was volunteer, no money. I was taking my own pictures, black and white photography, and going to local indie shows. Some of these were Savoldi shows in the New York area or Tommy D shows. Those were two guys that were running a lot of shows, indie shows in New York in those days. And I was timing the matches, doing it all. But I thought that was going to directly lead to anything, and it didn't, because there was like a 3-year break, and then all of a sudden I'm working for WWE because I was sending clippings out to wrestling magazines, to newspapers, and not really knowing how any of that worked. And it really went nowhere at that time when I was in college. But then all of a sudden, like I said, I'm working for WWE.
Wow. Now, Dave and I have realized recently that sometimes to get paid for what you like to do, you do it for free for a while. You know, you do it for the love of it, to get those reps in, to gather the skills that you're going to need when you get to that spot. So it seems like everything you were doing and everything in your blood was leading you up to becoming an author.
It kind of felt that way. It did for a while. I was really gratified. It felt like there was like an arc to my life, like a character in a movie, you know, like I've said. After I left WWE, though, it just, I kind of was adrift for a while for trying to find what I wanted to do. And, you know, I wanted to get away from wrestling for a while. Honestly, I got a little sick of it, a little burnt out, a little disillusioned. And I would still occasionally contribute to PWI, but I was doing all kinds of other things. I was working in higher education. I was doing marketing. I was working for, I was marketing for Edible Arrangements Corporation, just technology news, just whatever, you name it. Health insurance. I went to work for a health insurance company doing like copy and stuff for them. But it all involved writing or marketing. And when I started feeling I was getting too into the marketing thing, which I didn't want to be, that's when I decided to become a teacher. And I did that for a few years, got certified, enjoyed it. But then I started getting pulled back into the wrestling stuff with more of the books. That's where I started to get back into it with Pro Wrestling FAQ in 2014 and 2015.
Brian, writing obviously is such a passion for you, but would you say, I'm guessing the answer is obviously yes, but like therapeutic too, like, almost like just this good creative outlet, for you as well, like mentally?
Yeah, I'm not one of those people, some people will say, I don't care if anybody reads this. This is just for myself. That's not me. I want as many people to read it as possible. I enjoy having a voice that can connect with people. And so actually when I was at WWE, you get very spoiled by that. Everything you write is being read, by, if it's a magazine, probably hundreds of thousands of people. If it's the website, millions of people. So I got used to that. And so when it ended, I tried to find initially another outlet. So I wound up for a few years there, from about 2007 to about 2011, 2012. I dove into the world of horror movies, actually, because that was another great love of mine. That with wrestling, they kind of go hand in hand in a way. And I built a whole website. I became a notable voice at the time in like the early horror blogosphere. I had a podcast when podcasts weren't even a thing yet. And I did that for a number of years, until the wrestling kind of came back into my life again. And then that took a back seat. But the reason I was doing it was, again, as I had this need, I wanted to reach people, because I was working my day job after WWE was very dreary. I was working for a technology news company, which was all about Google hits. And so they were doing the worst kind of, especially back in those days, the kind of SEO things that would kind of spamming, just all this horrible stuff to try to get as many Google hits as you could get. And it was dreary work. I'm cranking out like 7 articles a day about like a new kind of Skype phone that's coming out. And I'm like, who cares about this crap? And so I went into the horror movie stuff as an outlet, to kind of get heard and get seen again. And that kind of carried me for a while until I got back to the wrestling.
I love that you love the horror movies. I got on my Creep Show shorts right now. Do you have a particular horror movie that stands out as a favorite, or what's in your top 3?
My favorite horror movie was always, for most of my life, it was the original Dawn of the Dead, the 1978 George Romero movie, the sequel to Night of the Living Dead, because I saw it as a teenager and it just creeped the hell out of me.
So good.
It's very good. As I get older, this is sacrilegious, it hasn't quite totally held up for me. Like I watched it a couple times in recent years, and it has less of an impact. I would say The Shining is probably my number one. That's a movie that has 100% held up for me, and it's probably, if I had to say the best made horror movie of all time, it would be that one. That's a big one for me. I love the old Universal monster movies. Again, those like Saturday, Sunday afternoons, syndicated TV in New York. It was like wrestling, monster movies, horror movies. So like all the Hammer stuff, all the Universal stuff, 30s, 40s, 50s. I loved all that stuff. Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein. Those are on my list. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I mean, the original one. I could go all day on that topic. Nosferatu, even this, which just turned 100 years old this year, and I rewatched it, and it's still one of the best horror movies ever made 100 years later.
I'm looking forward to that remake they're doing of it.
That's right. I don't know what happened with it, because I thought, isn't that the one where Doug Jones is playing the vampire?
I believe so. I heard a lot more about it, I'd say like a year ago, and then it kind of dropped off. So I don't know if it was set to release later this year or what happened, but anything like old school horror, like for me, it's Creep Show 2 with that raft.
Right. And so, of course, Creep Show was inspired by those old EC horror comics of the 50s. So like, that's something made in the 80s, but totally inspired by horror comics of the 50s. And, that's another thing. I love sampling things. It's my same mentality I apply to wrestling. I don't confine myself to just what I know from my own lifetime, my own experience growing up. Like a lot of people just get stuck in a mindset of what I grew up with is the only thing that's cool or good. Anything after it sucks. Anything before it sucked. I've never taken that attitude. I try to cherry pick the best of all different eras. I really do, with everything that I get into.
Yeah, it seems a lot like you're interested in the wrestling history. So how did you get involved with the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network? Because Brian Last is very much wrestling history, and he's kind of cultivated this nice collection of shows that, to me, they're all must listen.
I think he's doing really great work, and that's what attracted me to him because there's a lot of wrestling podcasts. There's a lot of content being created, and what he was doing really stood out, and it was something no one else was doing. I got especially pulled in by the 605 Super Podcast, and I've told him this because you had this essentially like a magazine style format show just focused on different aspects of wrestling history and done in a very intelligent way by people who really knew their stuff. And then you also had comedy on top of it, almost like Howard Stern, the classic era of Stern type of comedy, all together. And it was like smart comedy, like Howard Baum coming on and doing these great impressions of Magnificent Morocco and King Curtis Ayukea, and just having
the top 10 is my favorite
Yes.
segment.
laughing so
Barista,
hard.
Ken Patera.
Yes, hiccuping Fabulous Moolah. I would sometimes have to pull the car over. I was laughing so hard, and I kept going like, who is this for? This is so niche. I don't know who it's for, but it's definitely for me. This is hitting me directly. And right then and there, I started saying, like, I need to find a way to reach out to these guys. And like, I would like to be a part of this. I really think I could contribute. This is like, these are my people, you know? And I was a member of the Mothership Facebook group. We all started talking on there, commenting. Brian was doing one of his Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame shows where everybody debates their picks of who they voted for. I asked flat out if I could be on. I said, I think I have something to add. He invited me on. I was just a member of a panel. That went really well. He liked it. A few months later, he asked me to be a co-host, because every episode of 605, there's a co-host, a rotating co-host. So I did an episode with him. That's probably the one you're talking about, where I told some crazy WWE stories. And then before you know it, I'm on the Jim Cornette Experience talking with Jim for an hour and a half about my book, which was a dream come true. Like I couldn't ask for a better support for the book than what Brian and Jim have given me. I mean, obviously he wouldn't do that if he didn't love the book. I had to, because Jim is notoriously not technologically savvy. He will be the first one to admit that, I had to, and Brian helped me get this book to him because I said, I think he would actually like this book. Could you help me get it to him? I really think this would be something he would enjoy. I had to print it out, the entire book. I went to a Staples. I printed it out. It was like 3 reams of printer paper. And I mailed it in a big box, paid for the shipping, the whole thing. And I said, you know what? And we bound it. It couldn't even, so many pages, it couldn't be bound in one binding. It was 2 bindings. It was like a 2-volume encyclopedia, but it was worth it to get it to him and to get his feedback and to hear how much he loved it. Someone of his stature, I have a lot of respect for him in the wrestling business. I was completely overjoyed and thrilled. And from there, my podcast happened because I announced that for years I've been thinking I want to do my own podcast. I don't know what it would be. It would be something old school. I think I could pull this off. And I'm going like, I don't know. How would I get it off the ground? Who's going to listen? How do I publicize it? So when I started going on Jim's show and Brian's show, I started thinking, well, my profile's been raised a little bit more now than it ever has been since I worked for WWE. Like people are remembering me again. This might be the moment to do it. Like I have more of a name value. So I started testing the waters on Twitter, going like, hey, would anybody be interested if I did a podcast? And Brian reached out to me almost immediately. And he was just like, you have to do this with me. Like if you do this with anybody else, like you're nuts. And I'm going like, wow, I never in a million years would have even thought you would want my show on your network. Like I never presumed that. Who am I? I'm some guy that used to write for WWE magazine 15 years ago. So what? But he liked having me as a guest. He thought it would be a great podcast. He offered to host it. I immediately said yes. How could you say no? I mean, what a great platform to have, a built-in audience, and it's definitely helped get it off to a fantastic start. I'm flattered by the confidence that he's shown in me and just thinking that it would be worth taking a chance on it. So, that was a very cool thing that happened.
So it would be a dream to end up on the Arcadian Vanguard podcast network because it's such a tight-knit community. Everybody's like-minded. Like we're getting Vandal Drummond on for our next episode just because he is such a character.
He's awesome. Yes.
and we had to bring him on. But Dave, you were going to say?
Oh, I was just curious. The podcast, Shut Up and Wrestle. I think you might have explained this before too, but for our audience who hasn't heard, I'm just curious, how did you end up using that name?
So I want to clarify that. I'm glad you asked me that. This was not a setup that I planned in advance. Just want people to know that. But
Yeah.
because there have been people who have been like, "Oh, you ripped this off," and Eric Bischoff. Just because when I started it was just like a few weeks, pure total coincidence. After Eric Bischoff made that infamous statement to Tony Khan, "Shut up and wrestle," criticizing AEW. And people were saying, well, this is like Arcadian Vanguard is trying to sort of like feed off of what Bischoff did. And even though, Bischoff's on another network, so they're trying to, it was none of that. It was, I wish I had the ability to plan things out that well. Where it's a phrase, I'm not saying I invented it. And I said this on the podcast because I know that Harley Race's World League Wrestling used that as their catchphrase. There is a wrestling promotion in New England that uses that as their catchphrase. And we've seen signs in the audience that have said that for years, going back years. What it comes from is in 2002, I wrote a column for WWE.com, which got me in a lot of hot water on the early pre-social media message board internet. And it was called Shut Up and Wrestle. Shane McMahon had asked all of us columnists to get edgy and really write like some controversial things. I don't know if he expected me to go as far as I did. And I wrote a column talking about how what everyone was thinking. There's too much talking on these damn shows. Like when is there going to be action? This was in the era of Triple H opening every show with a 15, 20-minute promo every week. It was horrible. I'm sorry. And I called it out in the column, and it was called Shut Up and Wrestle. And it was like my 15 minutes of fame at the time. Everyone was talking about it, chiming in. Is this guy going to get fired? And then it was hilarious because people were on both sides saying, clearly this is a work. Clearly they set him up to write this. And then you had other people saying, no, he's going to get fired. He's a renegade. And it was neither of those things. It was absolutely not a work. It was just probably a sign of some internal disorganization that they were letting us write whatever we wanted. I wrote it completely of my own accord. I did not get into serious internal trouble. Kevin Kelly and Tom Pritchard called me out on Bite This. That was about as hot as it got, where they were like teasing that I was going to get fired. There was absolutely no talk of that. I don't even think Shane ever even read it. We were that far under the radar. But I took that name with me over the years. I had a column on the internet years ago. I think it was on onewrestling.com that I called Shut Up and Wrestle. When I was, in various places I've used it. And so I just wanted to bring it back for my column for like the 12 people that might still remember and associate that phrase with me. That is where it came from, the column that I wrote 20 years ago. That's it.
Just real quick follow-up too. When you write that and Shane is telling you guys to get more edgier, so you're going to write this, is there still some trepidation in your mind? Like, I don't know if I should do this, but you're like, all right, whatever, let's just see where this lands.
Yes. Yeah, there was. He took us all in a room because he was in charge of magazinesn.com. And I remember exactly what he said. He said, I consider all of you here, talking to the writers, your talent. Just like the talent on TV, you are my talent. You work for me, and as writers, you're talent. And I want you to be characters. I want you to make your name known. I want you to write things that will get people talking, not just kind of boring, bland, vanilla stuff. So I took him seriously. There were other ones that I did too. I did one. This was in the era of Billy and Chuck, where I forget what I wrote, but it was something about that, which I was trying to get really edgy. And this was in a time when in the mainstream, people weren't even really talking nearly as much as they are today about LGBT issues. And I was talking about how I can't remember even what my take on it was now that I think about it, if it was positive or negative, but like I weighed in on that. There were a lot of ones like that. I was like talking about Bruno Sammartino when nobody was allowed to even mention his name at that time, and how he was the greatest WWE champion of all time. And, we weren't even allowed to talk about him. So I was doing things like that. And the Shut Up and Wrestle one was the one that stuck because I think a lot of people agreed with it at the time, and I also thought with the podcast, honestly, the kind of irony I appreciated of calling a podcast where all you're doing is talking about wrestling calling it Shut Up and Wrestle because we never actually shut up and wrestle. So I thought it had like a clever, whatever, double meaning. I don't know.
Now, how are you enjoying podcasting? Is it what you thought it would be when you got into it?
It totally is, because it's what I wanted it to be, because I made it what I wanted it to be. I thought I just want to have conversations with people. One of the things that made me want to do it was I started years ago even thinking, you know what? I know enough people in the industry I'm at least acquainted with, friendly with, on a conversational basis with, that I could accumulate a long list of guests without having to ever cold call people or reach out to people that don't know who I am and have to introduce myself and cross my fingers. Like, I know enough people where I could just go, "Hey, Blue Meanie, what are you doing next Friday? You want to be on my podcast?" I could do things like that. I could do, "Hey, Bill Apter, you want to do my show?" And he'll, "Yeah, sure," like that kind of thing. That, because I'm lazy, the path of least resistance, I figured this is going to be pretty easy. And also people that I've spoken to before, because I just wanted it to be a conversation like we might have even when we're not being recorded, and just happen to hit record. That's all it is. It's not really an interview. If you listen to them, it's very conversational. We just go wherever it leads me. I don't have a structure. Sometimes people are like, "Is it okay if we talk about this now?" I'm like, "Talk about whatever you want." There are even times where I've gone off the path of wrestling per se. Like, I had David Marquez on there, the promoter, and he's very much like me. He's got an interest in showbiz history in general. And so we got off talking about like connections of wrestling with like vaudeville and old movies and just where comedy and where it all like meshes.
Disney.
And yeah, Disney, right? Because Dave used to work for Disney. And so like that was one of my favorite ones, but that's what I wanted it to be. And that's what it's turned out to be. I mean, it's all about the guests. It's getting the right people to come on. And that's what's made it work.
It's fascinating. Like, the older you get, you find out how much stuff actually is a work and borrows from like pro wrestling. You're like, "Oh, I've seen this before."
Yeah, or how much, pro wrestling was a part of the showbiz world at one time in a much more interconnected way. And in a way, everything else kind of moved on, and wrestling still existed in this little old school bubble by itself. But it used to be much more connected, like all the terms like finish and babyface and heel and high spots and going over, like those things were used in vaudeville. They were used in the circus. They were used in like comedy, writing and things, and wrestling kind of still retained all of it. But those are the kind of like conversations that I wanted to have. Just something on that was different from what other people were doing, on a different level, and also to keep it focused on old school stuff, not really the modern stuff. Not that I don't enjoy it, but I wanted to talk about the old school stuff and the topics related to whoever the guest may be. So if I have Jeff Walton on, who used to be Mike LaBelle's right-hand man in the LA wrestling office, we're going to talk about California wrestling. I just had Scott Teal on, that hasn't even come out yet, but we got to talk about Nick Gulas and wrestling in Tennessee and the split with Jerry Jarrett and all that stuff, because he was there, So it's based on who the guest is. That's where the conversation goes.
It's funny that you bring up Dave Marquez, because he is probably our greatest lost interview. The whole time we were doing the interview,
Oh, no.
he blew our mind with just each thing he said. Like, he went on this huge thing about Disney that I'm like, I never would have thought like to equate that with wrestling. And then we went back, the audio was lost. And I'm like, God, that, because one of the things we've done with this podcast is just talk to independent wrestlers, talk to different personalities about their experiences in wrestling. And you get to hear different people's inspirations, what they like, and it's all going to be different. So it's getting that like wrestling potpourri out there. Now, being into wrestling history, who are some of the wrestling historians that you admire, both that came before you and that you've dealt with?
I would have to say, working now, currently alive and doing their thing, Tim Hornbaker is the man. Tim Hornbaker is somebody also who inspired me to go, you know what? I want to take a shot at this. Not that I've been writing for years, but like, I love wrestling history. I love writing. How about writing about wrestling history? And so like his NWA book is, to me, I'm not the first one to say this. I think Meltzer said it. Like, if you were teaching a class about the history of pro wrestling, that would be the textbook you would give your students. I mean, like, it's perfect. And I've read everything he's done. I read the Capital Revolution book about the early history of the WWF. I read Death of the Territories. My God, what a good book. The Buddy Rogers biography that just came out, beautiful. For me, his research and the rigors of what he goes through is the gold standard. It's the high watermark. And so whenever I work on books, I always reach out to him, and he always has these nuggets of gold that he'll send my way. There's a couple of letters that I used in the Sheik book that came from him, like letters between the promoters. So he's one. I mentioned Scott Teal. I mean, he's doing the Lord's work with all the biographies that he's put out. I think he's probably put out more books about wrestling than any other human being who's ever lived. And in terms of like the autobiographies that he's co-written and things like that, I mean, he's got to have a record. There was a book that this guy's no longer with us, but Jim Friedman, who wrote the book Getting Heat, or actually it's called not Getting Heat. Oh, this is terrible. I should remember. Drawing Heat, which is, now Jim Friedman was a professor, I think like psychology or something like that, who also happened to be a wrestling fan and knew a lot of people in the business. And in the 1980s, he went on the road in Ontario, going to all these different like Ontario indie promotions in that era, like Dave Bearman McKigney was running, and like he got to hang out with all the wrestlers. He got the Sheik to open up. He's the only person that ever did that. And I used that book extensively. But his book, I think because he was also an academic and maybe a wrestling outsider and not so much a wrestling historian, that's probably the best written wrestling history book that I've ever read in terms of just the writing style itself. It's on a whole other level. Indispensable. I mean, there's just so many people. Steve Yohe has done incredible work as a historian. So many people that I have kind of stood on their shoulders to do what I did. There's no way that you can do this kind of thing without building on what people have done before you.
Now, speaking of doing what you did, we've got the book Blood and Fire, the unbelievable real life story of pro wrestling's original Sheik. And I'm just going to read Jim Cornette's words from the back of the book, because I don't know if you can get a more powerful endorsement than this. Jim says, "I have never learned more about any pro wrestler from any single book than I did from the tour de force that is Blood and Fire. The veil of secrecy the Sheik shrouded his life and career in has been lifted by Brian Solomon's painstaking research. A book on pro wrestling's most mysterious figure has never been attempted, now that one has finally been written. It can never be followed. Like its subject, the book is one of a kind. Wrestling fans should read it twice." What did you think when he sent you that? And like, how proud are you to put that on the back of the book?
I couldn't believe it, because I sent him, like I told you, the printed out copy. I heard from Brian how much he was loving it and was blown away by it, wanted to have me on his show. But I remember I reached out to him by email at one point just to make sure he had gotten it. And he got back to me immediately. And he was just like, I'm going to, once I'm done, I'm totally done with it. Or I forget how he put it. He was just like, I'm going to, like, what's the best way to reach you? I'm going to like come up with a blurb for you for the book. And then, is it okay to curse on this show?
Oh, yeah.
Because we're talking about Jim Cornette. Yeah. Then he goes, "You know what? Fuck it. I have something right now. I'm so excited about this book. I'm just going to put it in the body of this email. I'm not even going to wait." And he wrote the blurb that is on the back of that book. And I couldn't believe it. And I forwarded it. I thanked him, of course. I forwarded it to the publisher, ECW Press, and they even were flabbergasted. And I remember that Mike Holmes, the editor there, he said something to me like, "I hope you realize, I hope you appreciate and understand what a rare and glowing review this is from such a high profile and trusted individual. This is a very special thing you have here for the book." I think he almost wanted to put it on the front, and I was very appreciative, and I've never stopped being appreciative. I've thanked Jim and Brian a million times. I sent Jim a whole like gift basket of goodies. I was just so overwhelmed. I just felt like I have to make it clear to these guys, especially Jim. I mean, for that blurb, how appreciative I am. I don't want them to think I was just like, yeah, whatever. Like, I want to make it very clear that I appreciate this more than you'll ever know.
I think it's amazing he got it to you in email for him, because that's probably the toughest way for him to communicate. But he liked the book so much. He's like, no, we have to do this now.
That's the thing. And he even said to me at one point, because I found his email address, I guess, on his website, and it's the email address that's used for ordering stuff from him. It's not really like his own, personal direct. So I sent it to that. And he actually said to me, no, here's my personal one. If you really want to get to me quickly, the email I check most often, which for him is probably like once in the morning, right?
Yeah.
When he opens his computer up, God bless him. He said, this is the one to use from now on. And by the way, here's this blurb, and here it is right here. I'm not even going to wait. And yeah, I was blown away. Totally.
Amazing. Now, what was the process for the Chic book? Like, how long did it take from when you knew what you were going to write about to when you got the printed copies?
Well, excuse me. I pitched the book in the summer of 2019, and I sent just a kind of an early email to them, and they were interested in the concept. Then they asked for like a sort of like a pitch or a sample, and a formal kind of pitch, and I did that with a writing sample which wound up being the introduction to the book, which is the fictionalized kind of vignette of the Chic wrestling Tony Marino in Cobo Arena. That's how the book opens. That was the sample I sent, and they were sold on it immediately. And I signed my contract in November 2019, got to work. The world then proceeded to end as I was writing it. It's just getting started. So there were no trips to Detroit. There was no like legwork being done. I could barely leave my house. So for the first 6 months, it was just research from about November, December 2019 until the summer. It was interviewing people, going on Ancestry.com, going through newspaper archives, getting military records, that kind of thing. And then by the summer of 2020, I really started the hardcore writing. I was still researching, I was still interviewing people, but the hardcore writing continued for, I want to say, about 9 months. I finished the actual draft in March of 2021. And then for the next year, it was just revising, putting it in layout, getting photography, proofreading it, copy editing it. Excuse me. That's a really long process. It took longer than writing it. So, all told, the book came out in April 2022. So you're talking about almost 2.5 years of my life. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up. With the delay of everything because of COVID and stuff, did that actually maybe help you a little bit in terms of like, you had more time? You're like, all right, I'm going to do a lot more research. And, did it, in a way, was it beneficial in some ways?
100% yes. And I sometimes sound callous, being like, yay, a global pandemic that killed millions of people. It made me write a better book. But the fact is, my day job that I had at the time, I was working for a tutoring agency on site. The pandemic killed that because in the beginning, especially before people sorted it out, everybody was so panicked. Nobody wanted to send their kids to be tutored, in a building somewhere. So like their business was drying up. They cut my hours down to almost nothing. I found myself with all this free time. I was, then they had the lockdown rules where for a couple of months there, you couldn't go anywhere except to the supermarket, right? Or the drugstore. So I said, you know what? I'm going to make the most of this. I'm trapped in this house. My day job is almost nothing at this point. So I'm going to turn this book into my day job. And I wound up saying, you know what? 9 to 5, like a job. I'm going to go down into my office from 9 in the morning to 5. God bless my wife, who was also unemployed at the time or working freelance assignments from home, able to watch our beautiful son and do that kind of thing. And I went down here where I'm sitting right now, and I sat here for 8 hours a day, and I treated it like a job. There's no way it would have been as thorough as it was and get done as relatively quickly as it was, because if I was making it as thorough as it was with having to work a full-time job and doing it a couple of hours a night when I'm exhausted coming home, it would have taken me many years, I think 5, 6 years, maybe more to do. And because of the way everything happened, it made the book a better book. I mean, that is a fact, in my opinion. I would not have been able to say, you know what? I'm going to spend 3 hours trying to get to the bottom of this one question and figure out what the right answer is. And it'll take me down all these other rabbit holes of, oh my God, this is where he was in Europe during World War II, down to day by day, village by village, where they went. Those kind of things were the product of having a lot of free time, thankfully.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic, it kept me and Dave both in work because Dave delivers bread. At the time, I worked in a grocery store, but
Yeah.
we had the free time because of not doing anything else, the lockdown, that we were able to put it into this podcast. And me and him think that sometimes we wouldn't have gotten the interviews we had, or we wouldn't have been able to brainstorm different ideas for the podcast without having that time.
And it's just negative into positive too. Like, I mean, like for me, my other business too, delivering bread, like my sales increase because people are just shopping. That's all they're doing. So I'm doing everything I can to, increase the money and try to, also, as Joe said too, take the interviews we can get with the podcast. And we were working twice as hard as we ever were because of that in that situation. So you
It's
just
that weird mixed blessing of the pandemic. You don't want to look at it as a positive, but
we're not like,
come out of it.
Yay, pandemic. It's just you're
Yeah,
making
it's more than even just the book. Even in just all of the wrestling aspect of my career, I was able to focus more on, because usually that would just be a luxury when I'm doing whatever god awful thing, keeps my lights on. I'm doing that and then trying to squeeze the wrestling. Well, now I'm going full bore into my freelance writing aspects. I'm now a full-time contributor, meaning every issue to Pro Wrestling Illustrated, Inside the Ropes magazine in the UK. Those are things I was not able to do before. I've raised my profile higher, in at least in the world of wrestling media and online and all that stuff, higher than it's been since I worked at WWE, maybe even higher, to the point where, it's led to other things. It's led to Arcadian Vanguard. It's led to possibly other books and things, and becoming a self-sustaining thing. To be able to invest the time and devote the concentration and effort and to make those things happen, you just can't do with a full-time, like especially soul-sucking kind of job. You just can't do it. And that's why all these years it's only been a little peripheral thing on the side for me, and now it's really kind of like taken over my day-to-day work, and it's all because of all the time that I had.
That's great to hear. And it's funny how when you do something that you actually love and enjoy, it feels less like work and it's more fun. What kind of inspires you to create? Like, what do you look to for inspiration when you write these books and when you do things like this?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, it has to be something I'm interested in or passionate about. I mean, every writer has that feeling when you get an assignment that you love. It's like you could do it like that. You don't even have to think about it. I mean, there are articles I write where I can sit down for I'll write like 1,000 words an hour, no joke, not even an exaggeration. And then there's ones where you're not that passionate about it, and it'll drag out for days and days, and you're procrastinating. And so I try to focus on stuff that I love, just even because it's more productive. Like even in the realm of wrestling, like with Pro Wrestling Illustrated, I created a column there. Again, big surprise, an old school column. It's called The Way It Was, but I wanted to take advantage of the incredible photograph archive that PWI has that no one else has, like up to the present day and to the beginning of the business. Like it's just an amazing archive. So that column I could do it, and I don't mean this in a negative way. I could do it in my sleep, like, because it's just part of what I am, what I love. I just did a story for PWI on the legacy of Cody Rhodes, dating back to Dusty Rhodes and Superstar Graham, all the stuff he's been talking about on TV. I wrote an article all about that and what that match was like. I watched the match, what was happening in New York City on that night in 1977. I mean, that stuff is my bread and butter. And Cody himself directly reached out to me to thank me for it. That stuff comes easy to me. It really does. And so, again, because I'm at heart a lazy man, I look for the things that are going to be easy, and they're the things that I love the most. So, like, even in terms of like what to write a book about, the Sheik was something that fascinated me. His life, his persona, Detroit wrestling in general, not written a whole lot about. And so I wanted to contribute to that. So, I mean, I'm inspired by the things that I love. I mean, that's a very simple answer. The aspects of wrestling history that I enjoy and I like getting into, like even with the podcast, I could talk for hours and hours. I never get tired of it. I always have to cut it short because I try to keep it to an hour on my show. But I always feel like we could just keep going and going and going. I'm never bored. But again, it's because I talk about and write about the things that I love.
100%. Now, speaking of keeping it to an hour, we are just about at that mark. So
That was not a hint. That was not a hint.
I just we like keeping it to an hour because there are times we can just keep on going and going. We forget we're recording. So I'm going to hit you kind of with a 3-part question. Who are some of the people that helped you most with the book? Do you have maybe another wrestling book in you at some point? And can you tell us what's on the horizon for you?
So with the book, there's a few people that need to be mentioned. I mean, the acknowledgments in the book is very long. So, but I mean, like, boil it down to the most important. There was Dave Drayson, aka Dave Brzezinski, who is like the dean of Detroit wrestling alive today. You know, he was the Sheik's last manager. He had a direct contact to the Sheik for years. He knew him and worked with him. And he had tons of photography as well. And he was there to answer any question I had. I would send him a message at night, just, hey, how tall was the Sheik? You know, just random things like that. And he was always there, incredibly supportive. Also, Mark Boujan, who I have to mention, who was a leading light in terms of historians of Detroit wrestling. He was the man. He was the guy you went to with the history. He was a fan first. And he was so supportive and made a lot of contacts for me early on. He also passed away during the writing of the book. And that was very sad for me because he was so excited about seeing the finished product. He never got a chance to. So he was one of the people that I dedicated it to for sure. I mentioned Tim Hornbaker. He sent me some great archival stuff. The people that I interviewed, I mean, Terry Funk was great. Kevin Sullivan was great. I got a hold of Flying Fred Curry, who is alive and well and living in northern Connecticut, not far from me, and probably the person living who has wrestled the Sheik more times than anyone else alive, for sure. Priceless kind of person to be able to talk to for this book. So I have to thank him big time. Who else? Well, I mean, and as far as like looking ahead, yes, I absolutely want to write more about wrestling. Now, I just finished a book which I don't know, I'm a masochist or something. I was doing at the same time as finishing up Sheik, I was starting the next book. And it's because I pitched both at the same time and I didn't know who was going to say yes, honestly. And they both said yes. I'm like, oh my God. So I tried to space it out. But it's a book on the history of superheroes. So it's non-wrestling related, a little bit wrestling related, but it comes out next year. And it's different, but it's not wrestling. But as far as wrestling goes, I am thinking now of my next project. Now that Superheroes is done and I'm in post-production on Superheroes, my next book is definitely going to be wrestling related. I have a few things in mind that I don't want to get into too much detail because you never know. People kind of steal your ideas and things like that. But there's 2 ideas I have. I'll just say 2 possible ways to go. One is a possible book on the history of wrestling magazines that I'd like to do almost in a coffee table style, like an art book. Like, you know how you see these art books that are on pop culture, like comic books or pulp novels and men's magazines and things like that. I'm thinking, why not wrestling magazines? No one's done that. It's never been done.
That would be great.
Yeah, there's that. And the other thing is, do I do another biography? That could be another way to go. And I have a couple of possible ideas for that. I don't want to say who they are, again, because somebody might beat me to the punch, but I will say that they're people who are very important, high-profile names in wrestling history who have never had a book done about them. Like in the couple of people I have in mind, I would say that about any of them. So that's where I'm going in the future.
Now, if people want to keep up to date with what you've got going on and what these books could turn out to be, where can they find you in the social media landscape?
All right. Well, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Brian R. Solomon. Twitter's a great place, especially to follow me, where I talk a lot about the wrestling stuff. On Facebook, there's the Shut Up and Wrestle group on there. If you look up Shut Up and Wrestle with Brian R. Solomon, that's a Facebook group built around the show. I also have a Facebook page just as an author, which if you look up my name, Brian R. Solomon, there's a picture of the Sheik. That's my author page. I have an author website, which has a really unwieldy URL, but if you go to any of my social media, you'll find the links to my author website, and I keep people up to date there. And the podcast, of course. I mean, Shut Up and Wrestle, you can find it wherever you find podcasts, Apple, Google, Spotify. The website is suawpod.com. It's easy to find online.
Excellent. Well, Brian, thank you for joining us today, and we can't wait to read your next book.
Thank you very much.
And today, we are excited to bring you today's guest. He has been a radio host, podcast host, worked in the music industry, worked for his favorite baseball team, worked in and around the wrestling industry, is a wrestling convention pioneer. And let me take a deep breath, because if all that isn't enough, he has wrestled Dusty Rhodes. You have heard him on WCSD 660 AM, WNYG, and today he's on the WFP. You might know him as John Alexander or Big Pork Barbecue. Read Matt Memories to find out more about that. My Wildlife and Professional Wrestling, Country Music, and with the Mets. Everyone, please welcome John Arezzi. John, I hope I did you justice with that intro.
Yeah, who's the cat in the background there?
Oh, that's Thor. She's got to get in every shot.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, very cool. That was a great intro. The Big Pork Barbecue is certainly a story for the book, given to me by the Power Twins in Sunny Beach in Southeast Asia in 1993 when we were on tour there. So there's an interesting story behind that that's in the book, and we'll leave it at that. Great to be here with you guys. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Now, Dave, why don't you kick it off with us here?
Yeah, John, why don't we just start like from the beginning? Like any of us, like most of us start off as just fans. What were you a fan of? What enticed you about this industry? Just give us a start.
Yeah, I mean, fan watching it since I was 7 years old in the mid 60s. I fell in love with it. Fell in love with my favorite wrestler, Bruno Sammartino. Back then, Spiro Sarion, Antonio Pugliese, back in those days. And I always wanted to go see it live. I wasn't allowed to because you had to be 14 or over in New York. When I went to my first live show, August 30th, 1971 at Madison Square Garden, I got bitten by the bug big time. And before you know it, my other favorite wrestler at the time was Fred Blassie. And Fred was babyface on the West Coast, heel on the East Coast, had an incredible life story and coming back from injuries. And he just fascinated me. So I decided to start a fan club for him. So in December 71, I was able to get a permission slip. That's what you did back then, signed by Blassie. It was authenticated by Jeff Walton, who ran the fan club before me, and he had given it up because he was working for Mike LaBella in the Los Angeles Olympic Auditorium. And started a fan club for Blassie at the age of 14 years old and put out a little fan bulletin called the King of Men. And it won Fan Club of the Year in 1974. And I kind of started taking pictures at ringside, taking 8mm films at ringside as a 15-year-old, on and on and on. And then I bullshitted my way into a photographer's chair at Madison Square Garden with Bill Apter, George Napolitano next to me. And at 16, 17 years old, I was a ringside photographer at the Garden and started working for Ring Wrestling Magazine and started writing stories for all the wrestling magazines as a teenager. So it started that way. I could go on and on and on. So I'll let you guys. I'll catch my breath and let you guys ask any other questions.
I know Joe's gonna ask some questions, but it's just something you said there. I'm just curious. You're obviously at that point, it seems like you're a go-getter. You got a real do-it-yourself attitude because you're just making all this stuff happen. But what I'm curious is, somewhere in that moment, you're at Madison Square Garden, you're taking pictures. Do you take a moment to take a deep breath and go, holy crap, look what am I doing? Or is it just you're so busy in the moment at the time?
No, it's always, what am I doing? Because I think it's a little bit of a, something wrong with me inside my brain that I just never had any. If I wanted to go after something, I went after it. And I was a really shy kid. I mean, in high school, junior high, I hated school. I didn't talk to anybody. I sat in the back of the class with my coat on. I didn't have a girlfriend in high school. I didn't go to my prom. I didn't do anything. I hardly went to school. I hated it. Wrestling was my release. And in wrestling, I was able to kind of reinvent myself a little bit. And I would just move forward. And the way I got my press pass and the way all of that stuff evolved was really interesting stuff. I had a big set, as McMahon used to call, grapefruits back then, I guess.
Now, John, one thing I wanted to ask you about, because I really like in the beginning of the book how you describe and you talk with love about your family life and how at times, sorry about that.
No
And
problem.
how at times it could be difficult. Was it tough to include those details about your family, or was it just kind of like the want to tell the truth of the story? Because I thought you did it in a very caring way, but you really didn't hide anything.
No, I try to be transparent. And of course, you got to be mindful of those who will be affected by that story. And those are my family members. My dad and my mom and my grandma, everyone have been passed away for many, many years, including my oldest sister. My younger sister is still with us. And that was the person I was most concerned about telling these stories. And she didn't really see it in the same way I did. She didn't like me disclosing that my dad had worked, in an organized crime situation, aside from his running a grocery store and working hard all the time, and my mom being bipolar. So those are the things that she said, it's family, it should be kept close to the vest. And we just had differences of opinion regarding that. I mean, I felt that, you only get one shot in your life if you're lucky to get a book about your life written. And I wanted to be as transparent as possible. So I did what I felt I had to do.
And one thing about your story is I think some of that early, like seeing how your dad was business wise and maybe just that strife pushed you to be the successful person that you were. Because talking about this book, it's not just about one industry you broke into. You were in 3 different ones. Like,
Well,
how did it feel to get a job with the Mets?
Yeah, I
when
mean,
that is like your team.
yeah, all of that. I mean, with my family stuff, it was like, as a youth, all I wanted to do was kind of get out. I wanted to leave. And that's why I was very inward, and I'd kind of go in the basement of our home and listen to Beatles records or watch wrestling or watch the Mets. So my goal was that those were my passions in life: music, wrestling, baseball, not necessarily in that order. And I just felt in my life that I needed to do something that was passionate to me as far as a career. And I didn't know really what I wanted. I wanted the Mets. I wanted, the wrestling stuff. So I just wondered about, in my life path, just to go out there and try to do what I felt I was most passionate about at the time. And I was lucky enough to be able to get some of those opportunities and some of those dreams that came true eventually.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, the match story, I mean, if that you want to know that one in particular.
Well, I just want to know how it felt to be such a fan of the team, because I look at it kind of like when I was reading the book, I almost read it like how some wrestlers, their dream is to get to the WWE. And then when they get there, it's almost different than they imagined. And that's kind of the feeling I got from the book. Like it was a sense of honor for you. But then like as it went on, it kind of seemed to be
Well, I went on to something else. I mean, I went to the baseball winter meetings on the suggestion of a friend I went to college with who'd gotten a job the year before in baseball, and I knew they had a job fair. So I just went out of curiosity to see if I could possibly talk to someone about a position in baseball. And then there was a job posting for the Mets in the minor leagues in a little town called Shelby, North Carolina. And I had to find the guy who ran that team because I wanted that job. And I eventually, I couldn't find him initially. And then I called his hotel room, spoke to his wife. And after I gave her a little elevator pitch, he went and got her husband and we met and he hired me on the spot. And I went to Shelby, North Carolina. And that's where I realized that, all right, the dream is great, but this is the work. This is the $500 a month you're going to get to work 7 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, doing everything from sales, marketing, selling promotional nights. I mean, our day started at 7 in the morning with a sales meeting. We'd go out and cold call businesses all day to sell fence signs, sponsor nights, program ads. And then you'd have a dinner break at 6 to 7, and then 7 to 10 at night, you'd go and solicit people out of the phone book to buy season tickets. And then you do the same thing the next day. And then when the team was coming to town, right, it's your responsibility to house ball players, find housing for them. It's not like it is today where a lot of major league teams are now finding housing for the players. And then one night, mid-season, I went out to a bar to get a beer. And in the town I lived in, it was a dry county, so liquor was not available to be sold in a bar. There wasn't any bars. But you would have these private clubs where you would buy a beer, a 6-pack of beer, you'd bring it to the club, you'd check it in like your coat, and then you'd buy it back from the club owner. Crazy. So they had I went with the GM of the club, and we, a band took the stage with a female singer who just knocked my socks off. I couldn't believe that this girl was in this little this dive bar to say, you know, that's saying it nicely about the place. And I just couldn't believe this girl was there singing, and it was a girl named Patty Loveless who was doing rock and roll, and I just couldn't believe she was in that club. So she was the house band. I'd go every weekend, and I got to know her a little bit, and I quit my job with the Mets to manage her. She became an iconic figure in country music eventually. I managed her for on and off for 4 years. I didn't get her the record deal that elevated her to the top of the country charts, but she changed my life. She changed my life. And I wrote extensively about it in the book.
Yeah, that's one thing. You always seem to go, like, when your passion's running out for something or you discover a passion for something else, you seem to, like, seamlessly, not perfectly, you know, it's not that there's not ups and downs, but you flow right into that new commitment. And that's almost the story of your managing career that you seem to get, is like, you're there at those early moments, but maybe not when they hit the top.
Right. I am a good judge of talent. I know I have a knack of identifying talent, which I think is special. And I did that with Patty. I knew she was going to be a star. I didn't get her there, but I knew she was going to be a star. And then when I worked as a vice president for a record company here in Nashville, I found this kid at a pizza place named Kelsey Ballerini, who was just a kid who recognized me because I managed another artist. And she came up to me, introduced herself, and I invited her to sing for me in my office, and she blew me away. And she's one of the top artists throughout music today. I was instrumental in getting her start. But then I got fired by the record label because I was arguing on the behalf of another artist I managed that was also signed to the label. And so that was almost a bit of a conflict of interest. So anyway, yeah, but, you know, I've opened the doors for a lot of people. And if that's if that's why I was put here on this earth, I'm happy with that role. Because when you identify talent and then you see them go to the top, it really gives you a sense of satisfaction that you were spot on when you identified that talent.
Yeah. Now, what do you look for when identifying talent? Is there something that you can identify it as, or is it more?
It's an indelible it factor. I mean, it's an it factor. It's like, all right, there's something about this person that has star quality. It's the charisma, it's the voice. It's got to be the talent. It's got to have the voice. You got to have the the charisma, and you got to look at how people react to them when they're performing. So when you can identify that, it's just kind of a gut feeling in more ways than one. It's kind of a gut feeling. And the last one I was able to do it for, because I had a crowdfunding company here for emerging artists, and I was a judge for some talent competitions here in Nashville. And in the talent contest, there was a kid, a little wafy girl with a ukulele. And out of all these performers that were up there, she stood out to me for some reason. She just looked lost up there. She didn't fit in with the other singers and bands and groups. And the first time when she picked up that ukulele and sang, I was like, this girl's a star. And the other judges didn't agree with me. So she didn't get elevated to winning the contest, but I gave her mother my business card. And I was like, because she was going to school in Tennessee. So when she gets into town, have her call me. And I met with her. She was an alternative artist, and now she's on Elektra Records. Her name is Sarah Kays, Sarakays, and she's kind of Billie Eilish in a way. But she's an incredible artist, and I identified her. Like I said, I didn't get her record deal either, but I just knew it. And what I do for people to also, I put that someone believes in me. And maybe this person, if they're kind of, if they believe in me, maybe I believe in myself more. And it's about just kind of mentoring in a lot of ways too. But I love that Sarah Kays and Patty and Kelsey and even Sarah Darling, who's still out there doing it and big in the UK, who I managed for 4 years, that they're still having a very great career, all of them. And Patty's kind of retired now, taking care of her husband in Georgia. But yeah, that's a satisfying feeling.
That's one thing that came in through the book, is when you got behind an artist, you were behind an artist. You went to bat for them. It almost felt
like
my
jobs because of because of Sarah Darling. I mean, I got fired because of the way I felt the label was not doing the right thing by her, and that cost me, because I was supposed to manage Kelsey. That was part of the plan. And then when I get fired from the label, that's the end of that,
Yeah. Now, of all the businesses you've worked in, which do you think has had the most headaches? Because I imagine it's got to be same headache, different business.
Headaches, I mean, it's all different. Misery is wrestling. Because you can't trust anyone in the business. Everyone works you. I don't like the business side of wrestling, and I think that's why I never achieved national success in the pro wrestling business, because I wasn't a worker.
Yeah, that's
So,
true.
I mean, that's kind of, I'm not a worker. I mean, I'm not somebody that's going to lie to everybody and then backstab them, and so that's that part of it. Dave, you had a question?
I do. I want to make sure, Joe. I'm curious. I'm thinking as we talk now, and I go back listen to it, because I can relate to this. You talk about being in school, not enjoying school, and being that quiet, kind of shy kid. Now you've spent your whole career. You're talking to people. You're talking on radio. Do you feel like this is almost like it's just a skill? What I'm asking is, when all this is turned off, is John still like, I don't feel like talking to people today, I'm tired, or does it change you?
No, it doesn't. I mean, I never get tired of this, talking about it. It's my life, and I don't know if there's something, wrong with me, is, mentally, because I don't mind talking about it and being transparent and kind of shooting. This is just the way I am. I've always kind of been this way. I just kind of shoot straight from the hip, and that's kind of what I do. And I don't take shit from anybody. I mean, years ago I did. I could sniff it out now in an instant if someone's trying to work me, or get over on me, and I'm still fascinated, and I'm still quite observant of the characters that are in wrestling and the people that you got to deal with. And I keep coming back to wrestling, and then I leave it. and I come back and I leave it because you can only take so much of it. And then to save your sanity, you got to get out of it because it could tear you down. And
Yeah.
it teared me down in the 90s. In the 70s, when I left in 80, after I wrestled Dusty Rhodes and I kind of jobbed my way out of a photographer's gig, and then I left to pursue my career. I mean, that was fine, but the 90s did a number on me, with the Russo stuff and all of the stuff I went through with the Jake the Snakes and that whole business just destroyed me.
Wow. Yeah. And that's one thing. I've said it earlier, but you've just always been adaptable. When a situation is presented to you, you find a way to work around it. And that's been really an amazing part of is that something you have to do in life to stay relevant, is to just be adaptable and keep pushing forward?
Yeah, it's at this point, it's like I'm doing it because I enjoy it. So whether it's adaptable or not, will people dig it or not? I mean, that I have enough people listening to the podcast in its current state and Patreon members and all of that. It's something I enjoy. If I stop enjoying it, then I'm going to get out of it. If next week or next month or next year, I'm like, you know what, I'm tired of this. And then I'm done. Because the show is going to evolve into now some of the things that I went through 30 years ago or 28 years ago from 1994, 95. It was not easy. So, I mean, when I listen to these shows, and I haven't heard them all in 30 years until I upload them, and I'm like, man, that's right. I went through that. It's almost like you forget the shit you went through years ago. And now I'm reliving it. So whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But sometimes I cringe because I know, wow, I remember when that week happened and I was dealing with this stuff off air. So it's an interesting thing. It's very unique for you to have your life rewind. What happened 30 years ago, and every week you're reliving your life from 30 years ago. It's like a time machine, especially if you haven't listened to this stuff in 30 years. It's the first time.
So that'd be a very, very interesting perspective. Yeah, almost therapeutic in some ways, right?
It is. It is therapeutic in some ways. I really find it that way. And it's almost like I'm being psychoanalyzed every week when I listen to the show. And then, you have a different perspective when you're 30 years older. But it's still interesting to me. If it gets to be where it's like too painful or whatever, then I'm like, all right, I might as well get out of this. Yeah. So far, it's good,
That's one thing we found with podcasting is sometimes you need to shake it up, because you can have a format, you can go forward with it, but sometimes you have to make it interesting for yourself so it's still fun to do.
Right. That's exactly right. I think that I need to put a little bit more fun into the current version of the Spotlight, and because now I'm back at WNYG. If anyone follows what I do, I went from WNYG, a little shitty station, to a little bigger station, to EBD with Russo, and now I lost it all. Now I'm back at that little shitty station with one phone line, and the thing is, when Brian did the show, it was like he'd play some of the shitty commercials and some of the crazy callers that were calling. It was like some of these little nuances that really made you laugh. And so I want to try to get back to that a little bit and start putting a little bit more fun into it.
Nice. That we will definitely be listening. So getting back to the wrestling a little bit, what is something about wrestling that fans today will never understand about wrestling in the 60s and 70s? Because I have such an interest in that historical wrestling. I pick up almost any wrestling history book that I can get. But what do you think is something that's been lost on newer fans?
The suspension of disbelief, more than anything else. When people thought it was real, and even if you even had that little sense of doubt that it wasn't, you put yourself into the suspension of disbelief mode, and the heat of the crowds at the Garden and Boston Garden and Philly, and just the incredible way that the performers were and the wrestlers were. Kayfabe. I mean, there's none of that anymore. And I don't know if I had a part of breaking kayfabe when I started Pro Wrestling Spotlight all those years ago, but that's what the fans are missing today. They don't understand that this was at one time a entertainment platform that people believed was real. Now, of course, you don't. No one believes it's real.
No.
So that's what it's missing. Even if the business was built on deception by trying to work people and thinking it was real, it was much more exciting, and you could sink into a storyline. And when there was a heel turn, it meant something. And when there was a storyline like Bruno Sammartino against Spiro Sarion that ran and sold out Madison Square Garden for 4 months in a row, that was the stuff that you don't see today, and it'll never come back. But the business, it's evolution too. I mean, the people finding wrestling and being a fan of wrestling today would not understand, but that is evolution. The business evolved to where it is
Yeah.
today.
Do you think?
I was just going to say,
Do you think
about
the scandals of the 90s? Do you think the scandals of the 90s did anything to hurt that suspension of disbelief?
Well, I think what hurt it more than anything else was Vince McMahon going to the State Athletic Commission of New Jersey and saying this was all predetermined. So we didn't have to pay the taxes anymore and didn't have to be under their jurisdiction. But what the scandals did was hurt the business when the parents were like, well, there's a sex scandal and this ain't good for my kids to watch or go to a show. So, I mean, those scandals hurt the business with people looking at it as a kind of a dirty business. And it lost significant amount of live attendance and TV ratings back then.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I was just going to bounce back.
Dave.
That's all right. I wanted to talk about that kayfabe thing because I noticed that during the COVID era, basically when they had the empty arena matches and everything. And I remember watching a UFC event with some friends and thinking, wow, this is way more entertaining because I'm invested in a winner or a loser. Whereas as an older fan now who still keeps up with it, it's like, I don't have that in pro wrestling. Like I'm looking for a show here. And, the show has kind of been, it's like, oh, here it is.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, that COVID, those empty arenas was just was horrific.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just like you could tell that the performers were like they were just going through the motions. I mean, if you can't feed off the crowd, you're screwed.
There was like maybe one or two, and they really stuck out too. That was the one thing I remember. Was like, oh, I think it was one. It was Bailey. She like played off the commentator. She realized, oh, I can hear Michael Cole, and she started interacting with him. And I said, well, that's smart. There's somebody who figured something out and doing something different. And those people stuck out more. But like for the most part, yeah, it really put a spotlight on,
Yeah, it was really interesting to see that at the time. And boy, I hope we ever go back to those days.
Hopefully not.
No, definitely not. Now, before we get into talking about the book, I couldn't go away from this without asking about Vince McMahon. I'm not asking for any dirt, but you had the unique chance to be on his bad side. What was it like to interact with Vince? And another part of the question, how do you think the business will be after him?
Vince McMahon is one of the most unique individuals I've ever encountered. And I first met him in the 70s, when I was covering the matches and I backstage at Madison Square Garden. And, I got to know him a little bit and I'd shoot photographs for him, for the Garden program. I'd bring a little contact sheet. And he said, I like this one. I like this one. And, then I give him the pictures and then he would asked me because I was up in New England and he was promoting in New England. Can you go and shoot some pictures of the preliminary guys? He would say, they need a little love, and then I'd go to a little place in Massachusetts and shoot dressing room shots of a lot of the guys that didn't really win matches, and then basically getting on his bad side was never intended by me. It was when I started Pro Wrestling Spotlight in 1989, and my second guest on my second show was Bruno Sammartino, who was my idol, and I was able to get him to and taped an interview for the show, and then he started saying all of these things about Vince and what was going on behind the scenes, and I'm like, holy smokes! I mean, and then I called the WWF and I spoke to their PR person, and I said, listen, I interviewed Bruno because they were going to cooperate with me and give me guests and all that. And I said, he didn't really say a lot of nice things about you guys. And, oh, well, you're not going to air that, are you? I was like, well, I think I have to, and if you air that, then, you're done with us. And that was on my second show. And then basically, when the steroid stuff started, when Billy Graham came on my show in March of 1990 and talked about how steroids ruined his life and all of these things. And then it was kind of like when the Zaharian trial was when I broke that story on Pro Wrestling Spotlight. I mean, that was kind of like another step in the wrong direction when it comes to a relationship with Vince. But what really severed it was when he did a press conference at the Plaza Hotel after the Zaharian trial to announce a steroid policy, and they didn't invite wrestling media there. And I had to sneak in under an assumed name, and I confronted him in front of the reporters. And then he denied, I didn't know wrestling people weren't invited. And then, Phil Muchnick from the New York Post wrote about it. And when Phil Muchnick got involved, that was it. I mean, I was accused of feeding Muchnick stuff, and which was not the case. But then I became, maybe public enemy number 2, because Muchnick became public enemy number 1. And then the Donahue show, and I caught him in a lie. Well, I didn't. Well, Meltzer did. I mean, it was just kind of like about Arsenio Hall show. I went to Vince and I was like, "Didn't you say you were devastated when you found out that Hulk Hogan said what he said on Arsenio?" Oh, I never said I was devastated. And Meltzer said, "Yeah, you told me that." So, and Vince thought that we set him up, which was not the case. So anyway, that's the way it was. But Vince has always, made amends with people, from Bruno Sammartino bringing, with him and Triple H bringing Bruno to be inducted in the Hall, and Billy Graham back and forth. And he was always what's good for business. With me, I was just a little, I was a peon. I was nothing. But, I disrupted his business. And I don't think, I haven't talked to Vince McMahon since the 90s. So I assume that animosity would still exist on his part.
Yeah. How different do you think the business is going to be now after Vince? Because I'm personally very excited about it, because wrestling has been one way my entire life. And
yeah,
I've always preferred something other than WWE when I want a real good wrestling product. WWE is always going to be like a warm bowl of soup. It's comfort food.
Yeah.
But like, it's never like the top thing I like.
Yeah, I'm optimistic about it. I'm optimistic about the direction of Triple H. Obviously he's, he's putting more of his ideas in, and they're saying wrestling again. And I mean, there's a lot of little things that are happening on a week-to-week basis. And I really am optimistic about where that company is headed before it gets sold, because it's going to get sold. And what happens after that is going to be another interesting thing to watch happen. But I just wish that they, and they're starting to. I mean, the sense of history, I don't think there's enough of the sense of where they came from and how they got there, and honoring the legends that were preceded by the stars of today. I mean, they have to do more of that. I don't know if people care, but I think there should be much more in relation to the history. And they have Peacock and they have that streaming network. There's not enough history on there that goes back to the 70s and the 80s and how the business evolved into where it got to today. So I hope that that's a change that they execute. And I want to see the creative direction of what's going to happen with today's performers. I think, the jury's out, but I'm optimistic about what I see.
Yeah. I think I had heard somebody, I think it was Eric Bischoff, said that And he was the guy who said, I always liked working with Vince. I respected Vince. He said, but I think the creative process will flourish because you have to understood the creative process revolved around one man who had a very unique personality, work ethic, who called you at 2 a.m. and you better knew about this little minute storyline. So it's like, it's got to be damn near impossible to,
Well, yeah, the nuances of taking people's names away and turning a guy into it's like he had to go.
Right.
He was in there, he was an old guy, and that's it. It's over. Your ideas are not valid anymore. They don't make sense anymore. They're he had to go. And unfortunately for him, he got pushed out. But maybe that's what was necessary to make the business go forward. I mean, he got himself in a lot of trouble and he had to go. So now he's gone. So, or is he really, who knows? But,
Right.
but I think that, I don't think that Vince McMahon, seeing a picture of him recently with a birthday party with Cena, he looked horrible. So this was his life. This was 24/7, 365 for decades. When you yank that away from somebody who thought he was Teflon, who thought he was invincible, who thought no one could get to him, and he was the king, when you take that away from somebody, what happens to them?
Yeah.
Mentally, physically, personally? How long do you last? Interesting stuff.
Yeah, especially when your driving force is taken away now. Speaking of driving force, we are excited to have you here because of your book, Mat Memories. When did you decide to write a book, and what inspired you to?
Well, I always had the idea of a book in the back of my head after all the things that I was doing in my life and career. And when I got back into wrestling, when I dipped my toe back in 2018, I thought maybe there is a book here. And I heard so much about ECW Press that they published a lot of great wrestling books. And I reached out to Michael Holmes, who was the executive editor there. And he, ironically, he answered my call right away. And he goes, "This is so ironic. I was just watching a video with you and Vince Russo on YouTube, because Vince Russo and I had that, that heart to heart." And he goes, "Yeah, I know who you are." And he goes, "I would be interested in hearing more." And I sent him a little synopsis. And then he was like, "You need a writer to work with you." And that's how it happened. He said, "Here's, Greg Oliver is one guy. Scott Teal is another guy. If you can get one of those two guys to write the book with you, I'll give you a book deal." Scott was kind of busy. I talked to both Scott and Greg at the Cauliflower Alley Club. It was the first time I'd gone there. And that was in 2019. And after I talked to Greg Oliver, and he goes, "I don't want to do another wrestling book really." But when he found out about what else I did, the baseball, the music, he goes, "I like this." And so I got the book deal. So that's how that happened. So it was kind of like serendipitous. It was kind of like it happened pretty quick. I didn't really shop it around other than to one publisher.
Now, how long was the process from the idea of writing a book to getting it out there?
It started once I negotiated the deal, and I think the deal was signed in July of 2019. Then the process started. Greg and I would talk on the phone 3-4 times a week, and I'd tell him my stories and my life. And then, we'd go back and forth on chapters. And then Greg visited here in February 2020, right before pandemic, to sit with me and interview Sarah Darling and do a little background stuff on me here in the music business. And then the book was done by the summer of 2020, and then it was published in April of 2021. So it was a very easy process for me. Although,
That's gotta be good now.
you self-disclose and you tell your stories, and you're hoping that the public will react positively to what you have to say.
You had your book pretty much wrapped up by the pandemic, or
I would say it was done and completed and turned into the editors at ECW Press by summer
yeah.
of 2020.
Because I know, talking to Brian Solomon, he said that in a weird way, with the pandemic, actually helped him with writing because he had not as much to do, so all he could do was just focus on his book.
Yeah, that's happened to me too. Because I had a company that I had formed with a friend of mine in New York called Bantwango. It was a crowdfunding company for country music artists. And once the pandemic hit, it was over. I mean, it was done because we were helping fund tours and help recording. It was over. I mean, that business just went out and under quick. So yeah, it was a good time to concentrate on finishing the book.
One thing I really noticed that I liked about your book is the way you wrote about certain relationships. Like your care for Patty Loveless really showed through in the book. Your admiration for your nephew Dominic and how close that bond is. Those were things that really got me into the book. Obviously, your story is fascinating, but the way that your important relationships are portrayed, it was very heartwarming. And I think anybody that picks up the book will instantly be pulled in by that.
Well, thank you. I mean, yeah, my nephew was, I never had been fortunate enough to have kids of my own. So my nephew was almost like my son and still is to this day, even though he's got a great dad. And, obviously my sister, is a great mom. But yeah, for him and for me to have that bond with him uh, at such an early age, when he was just a toddler, and I'd throw Mr. Met dolls into his crib. And while his father was a diehard Yankee fan, so I gave him the Mets curse pretty early on. But we were able to do things and be buddies. And, before we end this, actually get to work together on something, which is really good. My nephew and I on a new project that I start next week. But yeah, and the Patty stuff, I mean, that was the hardest thing for me to write about because, she was the love of my life, really. I fell in love with a girl who was married, not to a nice guy, but she was still married.
Mm.
And that was the heartbreak of my 65 years was Patty Loveless. So yeah, it was not easy to write about it, but I had to.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'm just maybe a little. I'm just curious. For me, because some of the stuff you're saying really resonates with me personally, like some of the traits. Do you find like you're and again, I haven't read the book yet. Joe has. Like you're just extremely loyal to these people who take care of you. Like I know some people's like I'm loyal to a fault. Like I will go out of my way for the core people who help get me to where I am.
Absolutely. I mean, if someone's going to open a door for you or be there for you, you have for me that's lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing that's ever going to stop that loyalty towards somebody that you have a relationship with, who's helped you, who's been there for you. So yeah, those people are few and far between. But yeah, once you're loyal like that, there's no ending that loyalty. It's for life, as they say in the NWO.
Yeah. Now, you've been very gracious to give us some of your time. I got one last question for you before we jump into the plugs and everything at the end. What would you say has been the biggest accomplishment of your career if you had to pick one?
Wow. It goes back. There's so many things.
That's one thing. You have to get the book to see how much this guy has done. Like it's jam-packed with stories, jam-packed with experiences. And some people barely get to live one life. And I feel like you've lived almost three, being able to do these three different things.
Well, I think personally if you're saying what's your biggest accomplishment, and I think what I'm most proudest of is I was able to help my family when they needed it, is to give my nephew experiences that may have spoiled him, but he calls me Uncle Genie. He calls to this day, and he's 25 now. He calls me, "Hey, Genie, how you doing?" He said, "Because I granted wishes like a genie." And he said that to me when he was like 3 or 4 years old. So, I mean, that's the thing that I'm most proudest of is my family and the opportunity to help them when they needed it, and to give my nephew these experiences that are really will be remembered forever from going to baseball All-Star games to the World Series to meeting celebrities. I mean, there's a kid that's hanging out with Taylor Swift when he, so so that was kind of the fun part of it. But wrestling accomplishments, Weekend of Champions, Ric Flair, Buddy Rogers, everybody at that one convention, bringing AAA to the United States with Ron Scholar, 93. That was a big accomplishment on the wrestling side of it. On the music side of it, obviously discovering Patti Loveless, not getting her a deal, but helping Kelsey Ballerini open the doors for her. Those are great accomplishments. Baseball, that's still to come, and that starts Monday. My book, I wanted to actually call the book "I Should Have Stayed in Baseball," because that was kind of like I had a cup of coffee in it, as they say, but that was the best tasting cup of all. That was the ending of my book. But relationships are a key thing. So when we close this thing out today, I mean, I had a roommate at the Shelby Mets named John Gibbons. John Gibbons was a first-round draft pick in 1980 with Darryl Strawberry and a few others, and I was fortunate enough to share a house with him in Shelby, North Carolina, with J.P. Ricciardi, who went on to be the GM of the Toronto Blue Jays many years later, and J.P. hired John to manage the Toronto Blue Jays once, and then John got rehired. But John and I maintained a friendship over 40 years. I helped John's daughter, who was wanting to break into country music here in Nashville, open some doors for her, but we maintained a friendship. A few years ago, I had talked to John about him writing a book. I said, John, you should do a book. Well, who's going to want to read a book about me? He's a very humble guy from Texas, and he says some sports writers up in Toronto said they'd write a book with me. And I don't want to, I'm not interested. But, lo and behold, last year I called him. And, how you doing, John? I'm planting trees in my yard. I'm not really doing much of anything. I said, maybe you should do that book. And he goes, you know what? Maybe I should. And so I got him a book deal with ECW Press out of Toronto. He's beloved up there. So Greg Oliver got assigned the book, which was great, too. So then we started talking about doing some other things together. And before you know it, I'm representing John Gibbons. And John always negotiated everything for himself. But then we had an idea to do a podcast because John is a straight shooter and he's an icon, right, up in Canada. And he wants to eventually manage a team again. And I think he will get that opportunity. So this coming Tuesday, the Gibby Show debuts. We have an executive producer we hired out of who used to work at TSN in Canada for 30 years. It's going to be incredible. We're going to talk baseball every week. And our first guest, because John's got enormous relationships in baseball, our first guest is Josh Donaldson, who John managed in Toronto.
Wow.
Who's a New York Yankee now. And, on this show, I mean, each week we're going to have guys like Braun Strowman, Albert Pujols. I mean, big names. So I have very high hopes for this podcast, and it gets me back in baseball, which is full circle moment for me. And who knows what's going to happen next? We have sponsors that are interested in jumping aboard already. We started John's social media recently, and it blew up. His Twitter following is like 35,000 in less than 2 weeks.
Wow.
The engagement on it is crazy. It's at John Gibbons 05. We're still trying to get the blue check, but that'll come. But yeah, John took to it like a duck to water. And now we have this incredible opportunity, and it'll be on all podcast platforms, and we'll have a YouTube show too. So each week, the Gibby Show on YouTube will have the show with highlights and graphics and animation. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to that probably more than anything I've done in a very long time, to get back into baseball with my old roommate, John Gibbons, former skipper of the Blue Jays.
Congratulations. Awesome.
Thank you. It's going to be fun.
That's exciting. We will help promote that when we start seeing the links go out.
It'll be a shoot show too. And John doesn't hold anything back. So, it's going to be interesting because Gibby can say some things. He ain't afraid. He's old school. Let's put it that way.
Nice. I can't wait to hear it. So
He's a
thank you for
shooter.
joining us today.
Oh,
Is
my
there anything else you'd like to promote before we let you go?
My Patreon page, if people want, really rare content from 8mm films I shot, Andre the Giant's first match at Madison Square Garden, and photographs and audio and video, it's patreon.com/John Arezzi. The podcast is out there, John Arezzi's Pro Wrestling Spotlight. I'm at Twitter at John Arezzi, Instagram at John Arezzi. And those are the plugs. And buy the book, man. It's on Amazon, Matt Memories. Just please, if you like an autographed copy of it, I'll be more than happy to sign and number one for you. And that email is john@mattmemories.com.
Very nice. That's the way I got my book. I had to email you and get it signed because I'm always, when somebody comes out for a book, I'm a sucker for getting that signed copy. So thank you for the book. And thank
You got
you
a
for
number in
joining us.
yours?
Yes, I do. Let me go.
What's
see
your
what mine
number?
is. 149 out of 250. So I got in there.
You did get
fairly
in there,
early.
right? Because we're now that's it. There's no more of those, so.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you very much for joining us